They didn't come as explorers. They didn't come as guests. They came with guns, fire, and orders. Long before colonial borders carved Africa into fragments. Long before European museums displayed African art beneath polished lights. There stood a kingdom in the dense forests of what is now southern Nigeria. A kingdom of red earth and royal coral beads. A kingdom of sacred kings and metal that told stories. A kingdom whose walls were said to stretch for miles. In 1897, one of Africa's most sophisticated kingdoms was attacked, looted, and burned to the ground by the British Empire. Its crime? Refusing to surrender its sovereignty. This is the true history of the British invasion of Benin, not the modern country of Benin, but the ancient Kingdom of Benin, located in present-day Edo State, Nigeria. A kingdom of art, law, diplomacy, and power. And a story the world rarely tells honestly. But to understand the fall, we must first understand the greatness. The Kingdom of Benin was founded around the 11th century and rose to prominence by the 15th century. When Portuguese explorers first encountered Benin in the 1400s, they were stunned. They described broad, straight roads, carefully planned neighborhoods, a powerful central monarchy, complex political systems. This was not a disorganized settlement. It was a structured state with ministries, guilds, military divisions, and ceremonial hierarchy. At its heart stood the Oba, the sacred king. By the late 19th century, that ruler was Oba Ovonramwen. The Oba was more than a political leader. He was spiritual authority, cultural guardian, symbol of unity. Benin controlled regional trade networks long before colonial rule intensified. Ivory, pepper, textiles, coral, and later palm oil passed through its system. But Benin's greatest legacy was not trade. It was memory cast in metal. The world would later call them the Benin Bronzes, masterfully crafted brass plaques, heads, and sculptures. They recorded royal ceremonies, military victories, diplomatic encounters, lineages of kings. They were not decorative objects. They were historical archives. Each plaque was a chapter, each casting, a testimony. By the late 1800s, Britain had expanded its influence across parts of West Africa through trade agreements and protectorates. The Royal Niger Company sought greater commercial access. Palm oil had become highly valuable during the Industrial Revolution. Benin, however, maintained control over its trade routes and entry into its capital. The Oba's court restricted foreign access during certain sacred periods. Tensions grew. British officials believed Benin was obstructing trade. Benin leaders believed they were protecting sovereignty and sacred tradition. In January 1897, acting British Consul General James Phillips decided to visit Benin City. Historical records indicate that he did not wait for full approval from the Oba's court, despite warnings that the visit coincided with important religious ceremonies. The delegation proceeded. On their journey toward Benin City, the group was ambushed by Benin warriors. Several members of the British Party were killed. The incident shocked British authorities and became the justification for military retaliation. What followed was swift and overwhelming. In February 1897, Britain launched what it officially called a punitive expedition. A large, heavily armed force was assembled. The troops advanced toward Benin City with modern rifles and artillery. Benin's warriors resisted. But traditional weaponry stood little chance against industrial firepower. Benin City was captured. Large portions of the royal palace complex were burned. Buildings that had stood for centuries were damaged or destroyed. Thousands of artworks, bronze plaques, carved ivories, royal regalia, were removed. These objects were later transported to Britain. Some were auctioned to cover expedition costs. Others entered museums across Europe and North America. The Oba Ovonramwen, fled initially but was eventually captured. He was exiled to Calabar, where he remained until his death in 1914. With his exile, the independent political authority of the Kingdom of Benin was effectively dismantled. The bronzes, those sacred archives of memory, were now scattered across continents. Museums displayed them as art objects. But for the Edo people, they were ancestral records. They were sacred heritage. They were history. Over the decades, scholars would marvel at the sophistication of the castings, the detail, realism, metallurgy. Ironically, the very objects taken during conquest became proof of African technological brilliance. In recent years, International conversations have intensified regarding the return of the Benin Bronzes. Some institutions have begun repatriation processes. Others are still negotiating. History is not silent. It echoes. Despite the destruction of 1897, Benin did not disappear. The royal institution survived. Today, the Oba of Benin remains a respected traditional authority in modern Nigeria. Culture endured. Language endured. Ceremony endured. And memory endured. The invasion of 1897 was not merely a military event. It was a turning point in the transformation of West Africa under colonial rule. It reshaped governance. It altered economic systems. It scattered cultural heritage. But it did not erase identity. History is often told from the viewpoint of those who wrote the records. But African history lives in more than paper. It lives in bronze, in coral beads, in oral tradition, in ceremony. The story of the British invasion of Benin is not about anger. It is about understanding. It is about acknowledging complexity. It is about remembering a kingdom that stood for nearly 1,000 years. When we study this history, we do not do so to divide. We do so to restore memory. This is real African history, and it matters. Follow Priest Geo History for documented, powerful African stories the world must remember.